So thank you for being here, and it's a real pleasure for me to be here with you. First of all, I need to say you that I'm not a machine learning researcher. I'm a computer scientist, but I'm working on multi-agent systems and on cooperation, decision making, sequential decision making, with tools like game theory and I model trust and reputation with model logic. So machine learning is not my domain. But since 4 years, I led a French national project called Ethica, meaning ethics and autonomous agents. And I work with computer scientists, philosophers, and social scientists on ethical issues in artificial intelligence and on autonomous decision making. So I want to talk to you about these issues, the way we can design, consider autonomous system embedded with ethical reasoning capabilities. And basically, I will present you some issues, some architecture, and some work I did in the project. Okay. So first, to start, I want to discuss with you about the emergence of a domain that I can call it responsible artificial intelligence, and I will give you some hints about the issues that are behind. And after, I think we need to define what ethics is, and I need to distinguish between ethics and moral because it's very different, and there is some special kind of issues when we deal with ethics that are not present when we deal with morals. And I will present you some architecture in the literature about ethical agents, and depending on the time we have, I will present you some work we did in the Ethica project. And finally, I will try the difficult exercise to define or to highlight some issues in machine learning about ethics. Okay, so let's start with the emergence of responsible artificial intelligence, and let's start with an example, a famous example in moral literature. It's an old dilemma that I want to present you that is today, currently, in a new shape with the emergence of autonomous vehicles. This old dilemma is called the Trolley Dilemma. In this first version, the basic idea was, okay, we've got a tramway, the brakes are down, and the tramway is going straight on the railway. And there is 5 people in front of the tramway, and there is a people with a switch. He can switch, and the tram will go on the other way. And on this other way, there is 1 people. So basically, the operator need to decide, do I switch to save 5 people, killing 1 people? That is basically the idea of this problem. In the context of autonomous vehicle, we can imagine the following situation, assuming the machine is able to assess the situation. We've got a truck in front in an accident situation, and 2 people on the left and on the right. The machine maybe can decide to brake to avoid the truck going straight, but crushing the 2 people that are running on the foot cross. Or the machine can brake and turn left, crushing the boy, or it can brake and turn right, crushing the older people, or maybe it can accelerate, going straight and hurting the truck, maybe killing the people inside the vehicle. What must be done? What decision the vehicle must make? In a real setting, if this kind of accident arrived to me, I don't think I have time to reason and to decide with reason about what I can do in this kind of situation. But as a computer system designer, we need to take into account this kind of situation. I think maybe that people are more exigent with machine than with other people. And we need to think about this kind of situation, what we need to embed in the machine, what decision we can do. Is it more important to save the boy, to save the old people, to save the passenger inside the vehicle? Okay. All these kind of questions are linked to the question of ethics, because it is not ruled by the law. The law don't say us what to do in this kind of situation. So the question we will address in this presentation is are behind the law, and we need to take into account some emotions, some personal value, some principles, all the things that make ethics. Okay. So today there are many applications that are today interacting with human beings, or maybe applications that are currently under research to interact in the future with human beings. It's a bit different, but we need to think to that. And from all the broad spectrum, we can think about robots for healthcare. We can talk about autonomous weapons, obviously. But we can also talk about virtual systems, just like trading agents that trade actions, assets, money, and by their decision, they influence the state of human beings behind this kind of system. Okay, so all those questions, all those systems interact directly or indirectly with human beings, and we need to take into account this kind of questions. I think maybe some of you know Joseph Weizenbaum. It was one of the pioneers of artificial intelligence. He wrote the ELISA program, and he wrote a book called Computer Power and Human Reason. And in this book, he said that no machine must make decision in place of human beings, because never the machine will have compassion, wisdom, cultural thinking that allow us to make decision. Being right or wrong is not my question. But as a computer scientist, as an artificial intelligence researcher, I can wonder, okay, is it possible to ensure that an autonomous agent will not cause harm to other agents, human beings or machine, can decide according to cultural, compassional, and ethical factors, and I think it is the most important, that can decide beyond the law in a subjective way, and taking into account the plurality of people, of person. Because what we think individually that is ethics to do in a given situation differ. And we need to take into account all this kind of thing. So that's why since some years there is a kind of, maybe I can call it a new domain of artificial intelligence that appear called the responsible artificial intelligence. This is pluridisciplinary research with people from computer science, from legal science, from social science that are currently working. And basically the idea is to think many kind of things. First, the integrity and the responsibility of researchers, of us, designers and programmers, when we design artificial intelligence-based systems, and machine learning-based systems. To study the socio-cognitive implication of artificial intelligence. You know, when a machine say that the optimal solution is this solution, human beings tend to accept and say, okay, the machine said it's the optimal solution, so it's the optimal solution. I don't think anymore, and I agree. So what are the implications of using machine to help us decide? And lastly, we are also interested in study how to implement ethical reasoning capabilities in agents. And I will discuss some issues, but I will focus the presentation on this last axis. Okay. So since 3 years, yeah, there are many initiatives and reports at the international level, at the European level, and even for French people here at national level. In particular, the IEEE Global Initiative on Ethics and Autonomous and Intelligent System, I will discuss later. There is a report from the European Commission called Ethics Guidelines for Trustworthy AI. And for French people, if you are interested, the CERNA and the CNIL released some report on robotics and machine learning about éthique de la recherche, and a report from the CNIL, comment permettre à l'homme de garder la main. They are very interesting. They are, you can access them very easily. Just Google the title and you will find all the reports. So I will go on the international reports just to give you some hints. The IEEE initiative, global initiative on ethics of autonomous and intelligent system, start on 3 years ago. Yes, that's it. And there are around 500 people. Maybe some of you are working in the initiative that worked about identifying issues, references in the behaviorography, and recommendation about many kinds of ethical issues in the field of artificial intelligence. So basically, they try to put the stress on human rights, of course, and well-being, accountability, transparency. There are principles that guide all the people that work in this initiative. And in 2 years ago, there is a report that was released called Ethically Aligned Design. And it's very interesting because you've got a set of issues, and for each issue, you've got the description, the philosophical background, the technical background, some references, and some recommendation. Okay, it's very synthetic, of course, but it can give you some hint and some highlights on those questions. The report is huge because there is many groups that work on those questions, and I give you just here the whole set of working groups that are currently working on the initiative. Basically, how to embed values in autonomous intelligent systems. How to deal with personal data and individual access control for privacy, of course. How to deal with autonomous weapon systems. Okay, there is many things inside. So I will not go into the detail. It's not very important. But there is also a huge glossary of 200 terms in terms of computer science and moral philosophy. And you've got definitions, and it may be interesting to enter in the domain. There is also 2 years ago, the European Commission begin to work on a report. The last version was released on last April, called the Ethics Guideline for Trustworthy IA. So basically the idea here is to provide recommendation to ensure that an artificial intelligence-based system will be lawful, ethical, and robust. Okay. So among the 7 main recommendations, you will find something that said, okay, we need to guarantee the human free will. The machine must not impose its decision on the human being, and there always a need of human being to make the last decision in a highlighted way. Okay. We need to avoid to exacerbate violence. It's directly target on autonomous weapon, this kind of recommendation. We need to be fair. We talk about fairness in the last presentation. To be transparent. The whole process implied by the algorithm and the machine must be presented to the human users. We need to be, okay, sure and robust, but it's not a novelty. We need to respect privacy. That's a very important question. And the machine must be under responsibility. We need to know at each time who is responsible in terms of liability of the decision made by the machine. Okay? Is it the user? Is it the designer? Is it the people that gather the data and give the data to the machine? Is it the manufacturer? Is it the machine itself? We can imagine many kinds of things. Okay? So I just want to give you also some elements. We worked in the project I led. Finally, we provide also recommendation. Many people provide recommendations, and finally, we think that it is very important to be intelligible by the human being, by the user. So intelligibility is very important, but I think you need you know this kind of question. We recommend also to use modular architecture. It's very important to be able to separate the different modules inside the machine, modules to assess a situation, to assess a context, to compute causality, consequences, to compute decision. The more the modules are separated, the easier is it to explain each module individually. We also need to be cautious with quantification. Just think again about the autonomous vehicle dilemma. Okay, suppose I want to be a utilitarist and I want to minimize the human life losses. Okay, so I will put 1 point for 1 people that died in the accident, 1 point for 1 people that I save with my decision. Or I can quantify all this kind of thing. When you quantify, you melt things. And in terms of ethics, it's melting things is never a good solution and a good idea. So we need to be cautious with this kind of quantification because there are some subjective bias in this kind of thing. And of course, we need to be cautious with the subjectivity of modelization. Each time I modelize something, I put in the modelization my own bias. And I can make mistakes, I can forget something, and a machine always decides inside the boundaries of the model we give to the machine. So we need to be cautious and to think when we modelize what we do. Okay. And finally, we need to take into account the multiplicity of agents and human beings. Of course, Each human is different. An agent may be owned by one people, another by one other people. When we talk about machines, the machines are not a single entity inside a void environment. The machine interact with other machines, with other human beings, and we need to take into account all this multiplicity. Currently, there is many works on all the things I mentioned previously, but there are some questions that are still open about the notion of emotion. Nobody talk about emotion in ethics today. It's very, very rare. Previously, I said I assume the autonomous vehicle was able to assess the situation, to distinguish the truck, the people on the road. Okay, it's a difficult problem, but there is another difficult problem. We need to be able to assess the context. The context is different from the situation. For instance, I'm here, I'm talking to you, but I'm in a given context. It's a scientific context, okay? But I can also talk to other people in another context, and what I can tell, how I can behave, will be different. And what is the good behavior will be different, depending on the context, whether my activity is still talking to people, okay? We need to be able to reason also under limited computation time. I can reason longer to make the best decision, but in case of an accident, the machine need to be reactive and to decide almost instantly. Okay, how we can take into consideration complex consequences, complex causality relationships quickly. And finally, one question is, okay, let us imagine that we can embed ethics in artificial agents. How to certify that the machine will have an ethical behavior? How to validate this kind of decision-making process? We don't know exactly. Okay, so I give you some hints about the question we have. But I talk about ethics, but I never define what ethics is. We need to know, to model, to reason, to decide. We need to know and give a characterization, a definition of ethics. So I will present you briefly. I cannot go deep into the detail, but the differences between ethics and moral, because it is very important. I know in English the distinction between both terms is not obvious, but in French there is a real distinction, and we need to also to define some important concepts that are needed to be modelized in order to reason on ethics and morals. Okay, so firstly, when I talk about morals, it talks about a normative discourse. Morals define norms of behavior, norms of decisions. It defines norms, even on norms of situation. Moral says, from a normative point of view, what is good and what is bad. Okay? For instance, I can say, okay, killing is bad. I give a moral valuation about an action independently from the context of this action. It's a way to define something that is moral. I can say, okay, being courageous is good. It's not an action being courageous, it's an attitude. It's referred to something that is a bit fuzzy, a value. What courageous it is. Okay? I can say, okay, it's bad for a physician to not respect the dignity of its patient. Now, moral is contextual. It only applies to physician, and in the context of being a physician, I need to respect the dignity of a patient. To respect, okay, it's maybe a kind of action, of norm, dignity, a kind of value. Maybe it's a bit fuzzy too. Okay, but I can also talk about morals or norms. It is bad to forbid strikes. It's not an action. I've got a moral valuation on a norm. Okay? What is important is that moral is imperative. Moral say what is good and what is bad. Whatever the time, whatever the people involved, whatever the circumstances. Okay, obviously, moral evolves with time. The moral in antiquities is not the same moral than today. But for the moralists, the people that define the moral at a given point of time and space, the moral is universal. It applies everywhere, every time. That's it. Okay? Ethics is a bit different. The goal is mostly the same. It's to assess what is right and what is wrong, contextually. It allows us, it gives norms, of course, but it allows us to take different elements of morals and to aggregate them in order to say, in this kind of situation, knowing what is good and what is bad, the right action to do, the right attitude to have is that, or the wrong attitude is that. Ethics is contextual. It depends on the situation. It changes with time. It changes with the particularity of the people involved in the decision. Obviously, most of the action we do can be assessed by good and bad at the same time. Let us think again to the Trolley Dilemma with the autonomous vehicle. Okay, if I go on the left, I will maybe crush the little boy. It's a bad action, but I know that I can save the life of the autonomous vehicle passenger. So it's a good action. The action is good and bad at the same time. Ethics allow us to assess, okay, is it in this kind of circumstances right to do the action? That is the real difference. So we can say, okay, ethics, for instance, we can say, okay, it is right to do immoral action when it is forced by necessity. Ethics may allow us to make immoral action. For instance, okay, I think maybe most of us will agree that stealing is bad in terms of moral. But stealing food because you are hungry, from an ethical point of view, is right. If you cannot afford food, you can steal it. It's morally bad. It's ethically right. Okay? We can say it's right to not trying to do a moral action that cannot succeed. Ethics is a way, it's very important to avoid to do bad thing. But it may be wrong to try to do good thing that produce bad after. Okay? It's not a problem from an ethical point of view to don't try to be moral if you can't succeed. If somebody is drawing in the sea in front of you and that you don't know how to swim, you cannot be blamed to not rescue the people, to not trying to rescue the people from an ethical point of view. Ethics may also be based on quantification. You can say, okay, it's right to minimize the suffering at the expense of other criteria. Okay, so you can define also the kind of quantification, and you want to minimize it. It may be viewed as an ethical position. Okay. From classical philosophy literature, we can classify ethics from virtue ethics, ethics based on value. I will explain it just after. We can classify ethics from a deontological ethics point of view. So you've got some principles and you try to apply this kind of principles. And you also can be consequentialist and you try to assess the consequences of your action and to count for the pro and the con arguments about the consequences of your actions. Okay. Lastly, a very important concept is the concept of value. I talked you previously. Value are something that are fuzzy. It's some characterization that qualifies some context, some actions, some attitudes, some principles, some rules. It's a way to describe some elements involved into an ethical theory. And this description are maybe something like autonomy, dignity, liberty, and all these things are linked together. And when you make a decision, there is always some values that guide your decisions. Some values that you endorsed from your, depending on your culture, your education, your social position, depending on the reflection you made, okay? And for you, some values are more important than other values. It's make a value system. That's what you want to privilege in an ethical decision making. But this value system is also contextual. It may change with time, of course, but depending on the context. In the context of a scientific talk, I think my preferred value is to respect the truth. It's very important from a scientific point of view. But when I'm talking with a stranger in the train, I think the truth will not be my preferred value. Politeness, I think, will be. And even if the truth is violated in the discussion with the stranger, it will not be a problem for me. So values change over time. For those that are interested, values are typically human being things, but there is a philosopher called Grégory Bonnet that proposed values for artificial systems. This is very interesting. This is the title of the paper. You can easily Google it. It's very interesting. Okay. I give you some elements, but morals depend on the responsibility. Moral and ethics depend on the responsibility you can have in the consequences of your action. Let us come back to the Trolley Dilemma in its first form. And I want to present you a variant called the footbridge dilemma. In this variant, so the Trolley Dilemma, you've got the train, 5 people on a track, 1 people on another track, and there is a people that can switch. And the question is, okay, do you switch the track in order to save the 5 people, killing 1 people? Now, the footbridge dilemma is the following. There is a tramway, of course, 5 people on the track, and you are on a footbridge, and just in front of you there is a very, very fat man that is looking downward. And you know that if you push the fat man behind the bridge, he will fall down, He will die in the process, of course, but he will stop the tram. Okay. Do you push the fat man? From a consequentialist point of view, if your goal is to minimize the number of human losses, both situations are strictly the same. 5 people are saved, 1 people died. It's strictly the same. But obviously, you know there is one situation that is slightly different. In the second one, you are directly responsible for the death of the fat man. Okay? This is by the death of the fat man that the 5 other people will be saved. Whereas in the first situation, you're not responsible for the death of the single people on the track. Many things can happen. The train may stop. The single people may leave the track. There is externality. So when you switch, you don't endorse the responsibility of killing the single people. Okay, you take the risk, but it's not the same notion of responsibility. So it is very important to model and to reason in terms of ethics, in terms of responsibility and causality. It's not a simple question of minimizing harm or losses, of course. Okay? More importantly, ethics depends on our perception. I want to present you an experiment from a colleague called Bertram Mahler from the Brown University. He's a psychology professor. He's working with computer scientists with robots, and is interested in modeling ethics and blame. And he made the following experiments. He presented the Trolley Dilemma to different people, and each time the operator involved in the dilemma was different. Sometimes it's a human being, a humanoid robot, a non-humanoid robot, and a computer called an artificial intelligence. We don't know what is it inside. Okay, and each time the decision was made at random between switching or not, and a random justification between consequentialist, deontological, or virtue explanation was given to the participants. Okay, so it was completely random. The question was, do you blame the operator for doing the action he did? That was just the question. The results are the following. So the experiment was, there was 2 experiments with around 500 people each time involved, with a quasi-balance between men and women. And the results are the following. They are closely the same. You've got in plain the percentage of blame when the machine, when the operator decide to switch, okay, and in empty the action when the operator decide not to switch. So in the first case, he save 5 lives versus 1 death, and in the second case, there was 1 life saved and 5 deaths. Okay. So what is interesting is that you see for humanoid, and AA, generally, you are blamed when you switch. It's switching that is the most blamed. From a deontological point of view, switching is making the decision to kill somebody, to save some other body. It's a very difficult decision to make. And generally speaking, people prefer to let the nature act and let the accident happen. Okay? But interestingly, in the case of the robots, the results are inverted. People blame the robot more often when he did not switch the track, because people expect the robot to reason from an utilitarist point of view and to minimize the human losses. So when the robot does not switch and let the accident happen, it is blamed. But when it is an AA, a virtual AA inside the computer, the results are different. There is no good reason to that. Besides that, the fact we submit ourselves to the machine and we think that the machine should act in a certain way, and if the machine does not act in this way, we will blame it. So it's very interesting because there is no good solution. What to do? What to do with this kind of results? Okay. So, just to conclude, I will here give you some general elements. So we've got morals, values, the value system. We've got some moral rules that say, okay, it is good or bad to do this kind of thing in this kind of situation. We know there are emotions, perception, that are involved in the process. And with the context, we can use ethical principles to decide what to do given our desires or capabilities. And these ethical principles allow us to give us the rightful action to do. This is basically the ethical reasoning process. So our problem is how to model this kind of thing. And to model this kind of thing, we need to know, okay, what is good and what is bad, obviously. We need to be able to assess the situation and maybe assess the context. We need to be able to assess the responsibilities in terms of causality. We need to be able to reason on different ethical principles. We need to be able to model deontology, virtue ethics, consequentialism. And we need to be able to judge ourselves, to decide, obviously, but a machine maybe need to be able to judge other machines. If you think about multi-agent system where agents interact with each other. Okay, so this is all the question we need to answer. Okay. Okay, I'm a bit late. Okay, so I will just give you some the main architecture. Many people from the seminal work of Ron Harking on the law of war try to define what is the best architecture to provide all the elements I show you. The first one was the Zeus of Ron Harking. He tried to make machines that will be able to respect the law of war for autonomous weapon. Okay, so he directly embed in the decision-making system all the rules. But in this kind of work, the main problem is that there is no difference between the decision-making process and the ethics in terms of operational rules. You cannot reuse all the elements he put inside the system because there is no difference between the business rule, the rules of the applicative domains, and the ethics. Okay, so people try also to learn ethics. That's a good idea for some point, but so many work has been done about with case-based reasoning, and I saw lastly some papers about, of course, obviously deep neural learning with ethics, or multi-arm bandit with ethics. But basically, in this kind of problem, there is a problem of generalization. We try to learn some weight on moral rules to build ethical principles, but there is no deontology, not causal reasoning, and it's very difficult to have to distinguish ethics from just a simple kind of constraints. But it's morally different, obviously. And there is many work on formal argumentation. For those who are familiar with logic-based reasoning, there is a domain called formal argumentation. We try to model arguments and the relationship between arguments. It's very interesting because it builds some graphs of this kind of graphs that represent decisions, value that support decisions, counter-arguments, and we can find a set of good arguments to support a given decision. It's very interesting, but it's very, very high-level architecture, and it's difficult to model this kind of thing with all the thing I told you. And lastly, many people, and I belong to these people, try to model separately all the questions I raised with logic, first-order logic or modal logic. Basically, that's the idea. Okay, it's very interesting because it's make the approach is generic, but the main problem, beside the limit of modelization, is that all these kind of systems are a huge computational complexity, and it's difficult to make decisions quickly. So, just to give you some hints about what we did in the project, for instance, we propose this kind of architecture. It seems it's very close in terms of structure. That's what I present briefly previously. But basically, we've got some elements that are completely independent from the context and from ethics to represent causality, for instance, and responsibility. And we've got some modules that allow to define morals and ethics separately. So basically, that was the main work we did. And for instance, we modeled some ethical principles. Here is the doctrine of double effect from Thomas Aquinas. Just to give you an idea, this principle melts deontology and consequentialism and virtue. Basically, you cannot make an action if it is bad in itself. For instance, killing somebody by pushing the people behind the bridge. You can, and the consequences, the good consequences of your action cannot be derived from the bad consequences of the same action. Okay. In the doctrine of double effects, the good cannot proceed from the bad. Okay. And we've got some kind of model of in first order logic. We try to model also responsibility. Responsibility here is modeled from different point of view. With the same language, we can talk about counterfactual validity. Obviously, it means if I had not act as this, would the result be the same? We can also model causality, meaning that was another way to do the same thing. It's very important in terms of responsibility. We can characterize extrinsic necessity. If I had not produced the effect, okay, was it avoidable? and the intrinsic necessity, did I make this effect unavoidable? And by modeling precisely all these elements, we can try to build and to model a notion of responsibility that can be adapted to each application. Okay, all this kind of thing was embedded in the BDI architecture, and we use it to model some trading agent on financial markets, to decide what is good in terms of action, to what kind of assets are good to buy or to sell, and in each way. So we make this kind of thing, and also we use this kind of architecture to assess how the other agent behaves and to build a notion of trust based on ethics among the agents. The agents were able to say, okay, I think this agent in general behave ethically speaking from my point of view, obviously. Okay. So just to conclude, I just want to give you some hints and technical issues about ethics and machine learning. Obviously, I think you know better than me all the problems about explainable artificial intelligence and interpretable machine learning problems and issues. But obviously, I think the most important question are the societal issues. Which decision can be delegated to a machine learning system? As researchers and designers, we need to think about this kind of thing when we work on a concrete machine learning system. And who is liable in case of failure? Of course, we need to think about that. But in terms of ethics, I think that machine learning may be interesting for ethical modeling and for my own domain. And maybe the first question is it possible to learn ethical principles to respect according to a given situation? Okay, I saw some papers with multi-bounded systems or deep learning systems that try to address this question. For the moment, it's not really the ethical part is a bit poor, in fact, but maybe it can be interesting. But because ethics is difficult to make ethics with generalization. But I think a point where machine learning may be very interesting is to assess context. I said that context and situation is very different, and what we used in ethics is different depending on the context. To the best of my knowledge, I know no machine able to assess in which context it executes. So maybe contextual assessment, automatic contextual assessment, is a very interesting way to embed machine learning into computational ethics. Lastly, it may be interesting to compile ethical reasoning. Once I define a very nice logical model, okay, I can execute it, and maybe I can learn after this model to be able to execute it quickly on a machine. And maybe there is things interesting to do with encoders in this domain. Okay, so to conclude, I was a bit long on the ethical part, but I think it was very important. I will just do not hesitate to have a look to both reports. They are very interesting and they are high level, but they give hints and references that are very, very interesting. You need to know that ethics is multifaceted, contextual, and explicit. It is very, very important. And ethics is not a general constraint. ethics deal with particular, and that's why it's very difficult to use it, to melt machine learning and ethics today. But if you can assess the context, I think it's a very, very interesting way for us. Thank you.
So thank you for this presentation. That was great, and it was hard for me to say to you, it's time, because the end was very, very interesting to have this this vision of and this questioning and all the questions that you ask at the end. It was great to have them. So questions about, we have times for 1 or 2 questions, no more, about on this topic.
Jacques Cornet, gerontologist. I've been involved in ethic assessment in virtual coaching with emotion. And the very question is how to take in account emotion. Because, you know, the recognition of emotion is very difficult, variable in time, according people. So how we can be sure that a virtual agent can be ethical in you know, guiding people, letting free of decision, respect of dignity of the people. What is your opinion about that?
Yeah. Assessing the situation and the context is the major issue, in fact. In all the works on computational ethics in general, people assume that they know what is the situation. They have the model of the situation. They say, okay, I am in the front of a human being which is angry, who is afraid, and things like that. And the assessment part of the problem is never addressed. It's a major problem in computational ethics, and that's why I really think that machine learning may be interesting in this kind of problem to allow us to assess the different elements. But the major difficulty is that if we are wrong in the emotion assessment, all the reasoning behind will be wrong, obviously, and it's a very problematic. Yeah. I don't know if it's answer to your question, because we cannot, for the moment, be sure that we correctly assess the emotions of people.
They are personal data. Emotions are personal data, but they are not classified rarely in GDPR. It's a lot of uncertainty, and you know, for example, in the consent agreement, it's very difficult to know what exactly the power of emotion.
Yeah. I completely agree with you. I think it may be of interest that computer scientists that are aware of this kind of issues worked with legal scientists and lawyers to give them insights about these issues.
Other question? Yeah.
Thank you for your talk. There was like 4 years ago, there was a paper being published where there was an example of the company which is Uber, for driving, yes, and delivery driving. So the main problem was that in USA there was a something called there's a differentiation between the white and the black people there. So the service for the white people was way better in places than the service for the black people. So in such cases, as you have asked, I'm asking you again, who to blame? Like, should we blame the data that Uber collects? Or, and in this case, how can we know that the data is wrong or that the programmer has this kind of mindset? So how can we take actions in order to make some accounting for this?
For the bias in databases and in the result of a machine learning process, there are work about in the domain of explainable artificial intelligence in order to probe the system and assess when there are some variables that are the main factors. You can use many kind of techniques. They have all their limits, obviously, but there are things like that you can do. About the liability, for the moment, I'm not a lawyer. I have no answer, in fact. But I think that for the moment, the people that I think all the data that own the machines are the same, and they are responsible for doing it. But it may be interesting to have some open source systems that are able to test a system, and the civil society can use maybe this kind of software to test the system and maybe sue the company that not respects some kind of fairness. But the legal instrument is not adapted for the moment to do this kind of thing.